Episode 60, titled MFA Bypass Patterns, the focus is why multi-factor can fail despite seeming strongly protective when you view it only as a checklist item.
MFA is absolutely a major upgrade over passwords alone, but it is not magic, and attackers rarely try to break MFA directly when they can instead slip around it.
The bypass story is usually about flow, enforcement, and human behavior, meaning how the system decides when to challenge, how it handles recovery, and how users respond under pressure. When you examine MFA as a journey rather than a moment, you start noticing gaps that look small but can create real access paths. This episode builds a high-level mental model of the most common bypass patterns so you can recognize them, validate them safely, and recommend practical improvements. Fatigue patterns are one of the most common and least technical ways MFA gets bypassed because they exploit a simple reality. Repeated prompts pressure users into approving requests just to make the interruption stop. If an attacker can trigger a stream of push notifications or approval requests, the user's experience becomes a constant "do you want to approve" loop that feels like harassment. In that moment, some users will approve without thinking, especially if they are busy, on a deadline, or conditioned to treat prompts as routine background noise. This pattern is amplified when prompts do not clearly show context, such as the requesting device, location, or application, because the user cannot easily distinguish legitimate from malicious. The core weakness is not that MFA exists, but that the approval interaction is designed to be quick and convenient, which can become a liability under repeated pressure. Session weakness patterns are a different bypass family, and they show up when stolen sessions bypass further authentication checks even though MFA is enabled. Many systems treat MFA as a gate at login, and once the gate is passed, they rely on a session cookie or token to represent the user's authenticated state. If an attacker steals that session material through endpoint compromise, browser token theft, or insecure handling of session artifacts, they may not need to trigger MFA at all. The victim can have perfect MFA hygiene and still be bypassed because the attacker is not logging in. They are replaying an already authenticated session. This is why session integrity, token binding, and device trust become critical, because MFA only helps at the moment it is enforced. The bypass is not a failure of the factor itself. It is a failure to protect the post-authentication proof that the system accepts as good enough. Recovery weakness patterns are especially important because weak resets or fallbacks can undermine strong MFA without anyone realizing it. Most organizations need account recovery for locked-out users, lost devices, or employee turnover, so they build fallback methods that are meant to be helpful. Attackers target those fallbacks because they often have weaker verification, less monitoring, or more human discretion than the primary login flow. If a reset process relies on easily guessed knowledge, weak email security, poorly verified help desk calls, or permissive temporary bypass codes, the attacker can route around MFA by attacking the recovery workflow. The most dangerous recovery designs are the ones that treat recovery as a customer service event rather than a security event, because that framing encourages speed over verification.
In practice, a strong MFA deployment can be undone by a weak "can you help me get back into my account" pathway.
Misconfiguration patterns are where MFA exists on paper but is inconsistently enforced in reality, often because enforcement differs by application, by network location, or by account type. Inconsistent enforcement can mean some services require MFA, while others accept passwords only, creating soft targets that still grant valuable access. Missing step-up protections are another form, where MFA is required at initial login, but not required again for sensitive actions like changing recovery settings, adding new devices, exporting data, or accessing administrative controls. Misconfiguration also appears when exemptions pile up, such as trusted networks, legacy protocols, or service accounts that are carved out for convenience and never revisited. Attackers look for the weakest enforcement point in the ecosystem because they do not need to defeat the strongest gate when a side door is left open. The key lesson is that MFA is enabled is not a sufficient statement. What matters is where it is enforced, when it is enforced, and what actions require it. Token reuse patterns are closely related to session weaknesses, but the emphasis is on long-lived tokens that reduce the value of MFA by stretching a single successful challenge into a long window of access.
When tokens live for a long time, an attacker who obtains a token does not need to re-authenticate and therefore never faces MFA again during that token's lifetime.
Long-lived refresh tokens, persistent device registrations, and remember this device settings can all create extended trust that may be appropriate for usability, but risky when threat levels are high. The bypass angle is that MFA becomes a one-time speed bump rather than a recurring control, especially if the environment does not recheck risk signals and re-challenge when conditions change. Token reuse is also dangerous when tokens can be moved across devices or reused from new locations without strong binding to the original context.
A mature MFA strategy treats token lifetime and token portability as security design choices, not mere defaults.
Social engineering influence ties these patterns together because attackers often persuade users to reveal codes or approve requests rather than trying to break technical controls. Users may be convinced that an approval request is part of a legitimate process, especially when an attacker claims to be support, a manager, or a vendor, and uses urgency to reduce skepticism. One-time codes can be solicited through phishing pages that look convincing, and approval requests can be framed as, "You'll need to approve this to fix your account," so the user feels they are cooperating with a helpful action. This is not simply users' stupidity. It is predictable behavior under pressure when the system does not provide clear context or when training is shallow. Social engineering works best when recovery processes and MFA prompts do not give users enough information to make a confident decision. The security takeaway is that the user is part of the authentication flow, so usability and clarity are security features, not just design preferences.
Consider a scenario where approvals arrive unexpectedly, because it is a realistic moment where safe response matters more than cleverness. A user reports that their phone keeps receiving MFA approval prompts even though they are not trying to log in, and the prompts arrive in bursts during the day. The clue is that authentication attempts are occurring somewhere, and the user is being pressured to approve, which suggests either a credential compromise triggering login attempts or an attacker actively attempting fatigue-based approval.
The safest response is to treat it as an active security event, advising the user not to approve any prompts, to report the time window, and to shift immediately into containment actions that reduce ongoing attempts. In a controlled environment, that typically means resetting the password, revoking active sessions, reviewing sign-in logs for unusual sources, and ensuring the account's MFA method cannot be abused through repeated pushes without context. Mitigation thinking should connect policy, training, and adaptive checks because no single change solves all bypass patterns. Stronger policies can include limiting the number of push prompts, requiring number matching or user-entered challenges, and enforcing step-up authentication for sensitive actions, such as adding MFA devices or changing recovery settings. User training matters when it focuses on specific behaviors, like treating unexpected prompts as suspicious, recognizing support impersonation, and knowing the correct escalation path when something feels off. Adaptive checks can add context-aware friction, such as raising challenge requirements when location, device, or behavior changes, while remaining smooth for routine access. The best mitigations also consider operational reality, because overly aggressive lockouts or constant prompts can degrade productivity and encourage workarounds. A practical mitigation approach aims to make malicious patterns fail loudly while keeping legitimate workflows predictable.
A major pitfall is assuming MFA means safe without examining the flow and enforcement details that determine whether MFA actually blocks real attack paths. Teams may point to an MFA checkbox and conclude that credential risks are handled, even when session theft, token reuse, or weak recovery can bypass the factor entirely. Another pitfall is focusing only on the login step and ignoring post-login protections, such as whether sensitive actions require re-authentication or whether device enrollment is protected. It is also easy to treat user approval as a perfect signal of legitimacy, forgetting that users can be pressured, tricked, or simply overwhelmed by repeated prompts. Overconfidence in MFA can reduce investment in monitoring, hardening, and incident response readiness, which are the layers that actually catch and contain bypass attempts. The disciplined approach is to treat MFA as one component in an authentication system and to test the edges where trust is extended without additional proof. Quick wins often come from enforcing phishing-resistant options and tightening recovery processes because those changes directly reduce the attacker's easiest routes. Phishing-resistant methods reduce the value of stolen passwords and reduce the effectiveness of code interception and prompt-based manipulation, especially when they require strong binding between the user, the device, and the service. Tightening recovery means strengthening help desk verification, limiting fallback methods, auditing recovery changes, and requiring step-up challenges for recovery-related actions, so attackers cannot simply reset their way around MFA. Quick wins also include reducing token lifetime where feasible, revoking long-lived sessions during risk events, and removing exemptions that allow password-only access to valuable services. These changes are typically more impactful than trying to train users harder alone, because they harden the system against predictable human failure modes. When quick wins are framed as flow improvements, they become easier to justify because they reduce both security risk and user confusion. Reporting MFA weaknesses should focus on flow gaps and outcomes because stakeholders need to understand how bypass occurs without being buried in abstract claims. A strong report describes the observed condition, such as repeated unexpected prompts, a recovery workflow that lacks strong verification, inconsistent MFA enforcement across applications, or long-lived sessions that persist through credential changes. The report then describes the outcome that condition enables, such as the ability to pressure-approve access, reuse authenticated sessions without re-challenge, or regain access through weak fallback. The recommended improvements should be specific to the gap, such as enabling step-up for sensitive actions, tightening recovery verification, reducing token lifetime, or adopting phishing-resistant methods where they provide the most leverage. Clear reporting also distinguishes between confirmed observations and plausible risk based on known patterns, which preserves credibility and helps prioritize remediation. The best MFA reporting sounds calm and concrete because it is describing a control system behavior, not a dramatic story. To keep the pattern straight, use this memory anchor: fatigue, session, recovery, enforcement, training. Fatigue reminds you that repeated prompts can pressure a user into approving access even when they should not. Session reminds you that stolen session material can bypass MFA because the attacker is not logging in through the front door. Recovery reminds you that weak fallbacks can undo strong MFA by providing a softer path back into the account. Enforcement reminds you to look for inconsistent coverage and missing step-up checks that leave sensitive actions unprotected. Training reminds you that user behavior can be shaped, but it must be reinforced by clear prompts and safe processes, not treated as the only defense. To conclude episode 60, titled MFA Bypass Patterns, remember that bypass is usually about exploiting gaps around MFA rather than defeating the factor itself. Fatigue, session theft, weak recovery, inconsistent enforcement, long-lived tokens, and social engineering all show up because they target convenience and trust extensions built into real systems. The safest posture is to analyze the entire authentication flow,
validate where and when MFA is enforced, and prioritize mitigations that reduce both attacker opportunity and user confusion. If you had to prioritize one mitigation, start by tightening recovery processes, because recovery is often the quiet bypass route that undermines even strong MFA and can be improved with clear policy and verification controls. When recovery is hardened, sessions are better governed and enforcement is consistent with step-up where it matters, MFA becomes the strong control it is meant to be, rather than a comforting label.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.